Steve Crocco is our speaker tonight. Steve came to Princeton, New Jersey in 1979 to begin a doctorate in ethics with Paul Ramsey at Princeton University. I arrived a year later to begin a PhD here at the seminary. We went to the same church, got to know each other. We're in and out of trouble. He has been a dear friend for so many years and a covenant brother, which means something special to him and Daryl and me. I won't try to explain that, but I think you have a general idea. It's all about prayer and fellowship. So that's been going on for like 25 years now. So he went to Elmhurst initially to teach ethics, and then moved to Pittsburgh Seminary, and somewhere along the line took on responsibilities as their librarian. And I think you did an MLS in the meantime. Moved from there to Princeton to become the Lennox librarian here, and he's now at Yale Divinity School serving in the same capacity as their head librarian. Steve is a dear friend to the seminary and to the Barth Center, as he will now explain.
Thank you so much for Kate and Bruce for inviting me to share this talk with you tonight. It's called Markus Barth and the Path to the Center for Barth Studies at Princeton Seminary. And my purpose is to draw clear and direct lines between Markus Barth and his vision for the Karl Barth Archive and Foundation in North America in the early 1970s to what happened in the quarter century after that. And this is a story about Markus Barth and what brings us together this weekend, not just to consider his legacy, which is, as we've seen, remarkable, but the point is that we're considering his legacy here in this library building, which houses the Center for Barth Studies. This is not a talk about theology and scholarship, at least directly. It's a talk about relationships and personal connections. The takeaway from this talk is that relationships make great things happen in this world. And particularly, I think it's particularly evident in what took place here in the late 1990s between Princeton Seminary, the Karl Barth Archive in Basel, and then the Markus and Hans Jakob Barth families. I'm delighted that Shabnam and Anna could be here. I wish Peter was here, and Rosemary in Europe, she should be here. I mean, Rosemary is the historian in the family, and she'd probably correct everything I had to say. But the story does start a little bit earlier than what's here at Princeton Seminary. And I want to start with just a very simple question. Why was Markus Barth interested in starting an archive in North America devoted to the legacy of his father? Intellectual debt, no doubt. A strong sense of filial piety, perhaps. I don't know enough, and I'm not really interested in getting into understanding the dynamic between the two, a very complicated question. And those are complex matters, even for after-dinner conversations that have been fueled by wine with people who admire, both men. I've often thought that of all the Karl Barth children, Hans Jakob took the only reasonable course in life and became something completely different than his father, and that was to become a landscape architect. That's what I would have done, I think. But clearly Markus was not interested in running from his father's influence or making a name for himself at his father's expense. From what I can tell, it was just the opposite. My forays in the Markus Barth papers, talking with people who knew him, suggests to me that one of the reasons he left Switzerland in the first place was to try out his father's ideas in a different cultural setting, a place where different social issues were in play. So in Pittsburgh, for example, he lived in a Jewish neighborhood, primarily Jewish neighborhood. He attended a biracial church and not far from the main housing projects in Pittsburgh. So I think he was very keenly aware of social issues, and my hunch is that he was interested to see how his father's theology would play out in these kinds of settings. And so, when it came time to look for a job after being a pastor, the United States seemed like a good option. He had several options, if I recall, and he went to Dubuque, Iowa for a couple of years in 1953, and then University of Chicago, and finally Pittsburgh Seminary, where he stayed until he returned to Basel. His father died when he was on the faculty at Pittsburgh Seminary, and in the months that followed, there was considerable activity, led by Markus Barth, to set up organizations devoted to his father's legacy in Switzerland and in North America. To me, that says he was secure enough in his sense of himself that he could recognize a work that needed to be done on behalf of another. Now, as you probably all know, Karl Barth's will left clear instructions for all the unpublished materials in the archive, and there's massive numbers of unpublished materials. It led to the formulation of a Nachlasskommission, a legacy commission that consisted of Karl Barth's living children and his son-in-law, Max Zellweger, which had responsibility for Barth's literary remains. A Stiftung, or foundation, was also formed in July 1971 to make the works of Barth known, to encourage the study of his thought, to collect writings of Karl Barth, to publish an edition of his works, to promote and support biblical and ecumenical study, research, conferences, publications. And it would be happy to solicit and collect funds from anybody who wanted to donate to the publication of his works. The idea of a Karl Barth Center in North America was not far behind the one in Switzerland. They were thought of almost simultaneously. Why North America? I mean, all you have to do is think of the steady stream of people who went to Basel to do doctoral work with Karl Barth. John Howard Yoder and James Smart and Sandy McElway and Brevard Childs, for example. And I think there was also a belief, whether it was justified or not, that there was money in the United States that might be useful to help publish this great literary output. So in 1971, Markus Barth prepared a proposal to establish a Karl Barth Society, a Karl Barth Archive, and an ecumenical center at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. As he envisioned it, this North American Barth activity would be closely related to the activity in Switzerland. It would be housed in the library at Pittsburgh Seminary, be the property of the school. It would be owned by Pittsburgh Seminary, but it'd be open to scholars anywhere. It would contain all the published works by Karl Barth, including the posthumous works, a microfilm collection of at least some of the unpublished works, a complete collection of secondary literature, a collection of related background material, such as on the church struggle, and then finally a collection of sound recordings and photographs and memorabilia. Markus Barth expected Pittsburgh Seminary to contribute more than space. He thought they should contribute money for a budget, perhaps a director. And it would, again, like I said a minute ago, it hopefully helped to raise money to support the publication of the Gesamtausgabe. I mean, it's not difficult to imagine that the Markus Barth saw this as a great plum for a seminary like Pittsburgh. In the 60s, when he was there, Pittsburgh Seminary had great aspirations to be something of a theological university. It had interesting ties with the University of Pittsburgh to share a doctoral program, to share something in public health, and perhaps something in education. I'm not quite sure about that. At that time, the University of Pittsburgh was a private university. In the mid-60s, it became state-related, which raised all sorts of questions, not just about bureaucracy, but about how do you incorporate this theology thing. So that sort of died. One of the early snags that Markus Barth ran into was, how do you collect money in the United States to send to Switzerland? And it wasn't as easy as it might be today. He wanted to do it legally, and he needed to create trust agreements that would, and bylaws that would be acceptable in both countries. How could a Swiss foundation have an arm in North America? And again, it wasn't an easy question. he wrote to an attorney in Pittsburgh to say, help me with this. And the attorney wrote back, he said, I think the idea is workable, but, quote, many more hours of planning are necessary, thinking and research than perhaps you imagined. So you can see where that went. That went nowhere. The form this fundraising group took was to be something like a friends group, and that was acceptable. The purpose of the foundation was to provide the necessary funds for the conservation and the addition of the literary legacy, to stimulate research. The same things in Switzerland. And the different parts of this and how they were to relate were never really completely worked out. This whole episode takes place in a very short time, a year maybe, in Markus Barth's life. When Markus Barth pitched the idea of a Karl Barth Center at Pittsburgh Seminary, the fortunes of many theological schools like Pittsburgh were on the downturn. Ambitious periods before gave way to periods of poverty, and Pittsburgh was really in bad shape financially in that time. It stayed that way for quite a while, and in the 80s, President Callion raised enormous amounts of money and invested it wisely, and now the school's in great shape. As I read this correspondence, it was almost as though the Pittsburgh Seminary is like, well, what can we get out of this? All right, you want to start this center here. How can we get our hands on something? What will this do for us? And so that was what was going on there. And Markus later tries to do this at the University of Toronto. He's good friends with David Dempson, and after Pittsburgh fails, he's in touch with David Dempson, and I don't know who suggested what, but clearly there was little interest in raising money for the Gesamtausgabe. That was just never anybody's idea. I couldn't get anybody enthusiastic about that. An idea of an ecumenical theological center had appeal, but not tied too closely to Karl Barth, because there were a lot of interesting things happening in American theology at the time. A few library shelves with duplicate Barth materials, yeah, that's doable. But ongoing budgets for the library and for a director, those were all secretarial support, those were all much more complicated. Conferences, again, they were popular, that worked. And then there were a number of scholars at Pittsburgh and then Toronto who were interested in a duplicate library of Karl Barth's papers. But that's what they wanted. They didn't want the things to support that. So negotiations with Pittsburgh Seminary did not go well, to the point that Markus Barth was looking for a new position by the end of 1971, not just for this archive, but for himself. He was not happy there, and there were conversations with Toronto about the center going there, and then Markus Barth taking a position at the University of Toronto. I don't know how far the negotiations went, but Dempson and Barth talked about it quite a bit. And it's funny, in these letters, Dempson's letters to Markus Barth, after they go through some business, Dempson is always writing a theological question at the end. Oh, by the way, what is your view on this or that? And Markus would write back these nice long letters to him answering his questions. I can show this to you. I have this. This is a Markus Barth it's a typescript, and his tiny handwriting on it. But he has this establishment of a North American Karl Barth Foundation, a Barth Archive, an ecumenical center. And somewhere in one of these copies, it's got Pittsburgh Seminary crossed out and Toronto written in. That's the level of this. This was all happening rather quickly. And but nothing really came in the Toronto efforts either. When Markus Barth was negotiating with Douglas Jay of the Toronto School of Theology, Dempson urged him to establish the center in a way that it could run its own show. Otherwise, it would be lost to bureaucracy. So that was a problem that Dempson feared. I've often wondered, what if Markus Barth had thought to knock on James McCord's door here back in 1970, 71? History might have changed drastically. It's one of those big questions that I ponder. Well, an offer to Markus from the University of Basel turned up, and he returned to Switzerland in May 1972. He was not only returning to a teaching position, but he was returning to do battle with Friedrich Wilhelm Marquardt over his interpretation of Karl Barth's socialism. He left with little settled about a North American Barth Center. He threw himself into it for a short time, Pittsburgh Seminary, Toronto, and then he went back, and there's not really, and the correspondence seems to drop off after that. There was the Karl Barth Society was in good place. Good things came of it. There was the conferences, a newsletter. But the Karl Barth Society North America chapter fell short of Marcus's vision for a full program. There was a major colloquium on the theology of Karl Barth in Toronto in October 1972. Markus returned to that. Were you at that conference? Okay. I thought I saw your name there. But like I said, the Markus Barth files I've seen, and there could be more, they seem to drop off after that. By way of background to the next chapter of this little paper, I never met Markus Barth. I grew up in Pittsburgh, and while I was playing touch football, going fishing, and smoking cigarettes behind my parents' garage so they couldn't see me, 8 miles away, Markus Barth was doing serious theological work. And that's when I was just too young to be there. The year I graduated from high school, he was having these conversations with the University of Toronto about creating an archive there. And then he on his way to Basel. I was a student, and I mentioned this for one silly reason, because one of my sons was very talented in the old days with Photoshop. And this picture gets around, but this is a picture that he photoshopped of me with Markus and Karl Barth. I just want to make it clear to everybody that I never met these men, but pictures are already getting out there. So. You should put this on the. I should have. So, anyway, unfortunately, I missed Markus Barth at Pittsburgh Seminary. I came a couple years later, and the atmosphere in my students' days was that a feeling that greatness had departed. We didn't know Markus Barth, or didn't know Dietrich Ritschl or Arthur Cochran, but we knew of them and their work and their theology, and felt like we missed something. Now, they were still an exciting place, but in those days, after Markus Barth, Pittsburgh Seminary came to be dominated by Reinhold Niebuhr and Paul Tillich and liberation theology, the early liberation theology, and there wasn't much interest in Karl Barth at all. Ford Battles anchored the history faculty and taught courses in patristics and Calvin, and the only thing that Pittsburgh Seminary students had to boast about was that he got to translate the Calvin's Institutes and not Ed Dowey, which I know was always a sore spot in Ed's life, but that was the only thing Pittsburgh Seminary students could boast about. Honestly, the only sign I remember of Karl Barth, or hearing much about Karl Barth as a seminary student, was his desk, which was in the lobby of the library that Markus had arranged to give to Pittsburgh. In return, Pittsburgh Seminary gave Karl Barth an elegant modern desk. And it's a lovely desk. Is it still in Dieter's home? I think so. It's a beautiful desk. To this day, Karl Barth's desk, which first belonged to his father and where he wrote the Church Dogmatics, is in the Pittsburgh Library, although it's not in the prominent place it was when I was a student or when I was the librarian especially. But it's still there, and it still draws a crowd. I don't believe I seriously encountered Karl Barth until my senior year in seminary, when I took a course on the authority of Scripture and read large sections of two want to. The course was taught by George Kem, a Harvard-trained systematic theologian who was very interested in Karl Barth early in his career, but like many in the 60s, lost interest. He got interested in hermeneutics and Pannenberg and other such things. There were those at Pittsburgh Seminary who said that Karl Barth's influence in North America was dead, it was done. It had run its course. There were others, like one of my Old Testament professors, Eberhard von Waldo, who said that this is nonsense. Karl Barth's influence has not yet begun to be felt in North America. I tucked that away. One of Markus Barth's closest friends on the faculty was Dikron Hadidian. He was the librarian there, and he edited a Festschrift for Markus Barth at some point along the way. He was also a New Testament scholar and influenced me greatly along two paths. First, his interest in biblical theology, and then his career as a theological librarian. After starting doctoral work here, as Bruce mentioned, I became a convert to Karl Barth, and Bruce and I got to be great friends. And then if you finish my degree, a few years later, I joined the faculty at Elmhurst College, and there was a guy there named Ronald Getz. I don't know if anybody knows. There's Ron Getz. Ron was an avid reader of Karl Barth. He published almost everything he wrote in the Christian Century. And he was the host to the regular meetings of a thriving Karl Barth Society, North America Midwest chapter. And they had great meetings there regularly. I attended those meetings with people like Donald Blesch and Donald Dayton and David Dempson and Walt Lowe and James Nelson and Russ Palmer. George Hunzinger came to a meeting, talked. Did you ever go to those meetings? They were terrific meetings. And I do remember just a very few conversations with Ron Getz whether we should try to move the small library that Dempson had collected together at Toronto and move that to Elmhurst and set up something there. It was while I was working in the archives doing research at Elmhurst that my love of libraries began to grow. I discovered this stash of papers belonging to Reinhold Niebuhr and H. Richard Niebuhr and Paul Lehmann. They were all students there, and H. Richard Niebuhr was president. This was like this great cache of stuff, and it was fascinating. Got interested in libraries and started thinking, what's it like to build a research collection? And I thought about doing that for H. Richard Niebuhr. Well, in 1987, I ended up diving in and became a librarian, and actually went back to Pittsburgh Seminary on the condition I go get to library school, which is what I did. That's when Hadidian took me aside and told me all about Markus Barth and his efforts to start a Center for Barth Studies at Pittsburgh. Hadidian was still bitter that Pittsburgh Seminary had rebuffed his efforts. And he admitted, the opportunity at Toronto died quickly too, and that with Markus back in Switzerland, the idea itself seems to have at least went dormant. As Hadidian's successor at Pittsburgh, the presence of Karl Barth's desk in the main lobby, as well as some, I called them the Bartefacts, I found in the archives. Just like stuff out here, pipe, pens, eyeglasses, it's cool stuff. I began to, think about, what does this mean to start a research collection? Then Thomas Torrance came to Pittsburgh to give lectures, and one day I found him sitting on the floor right next to the Barth desk with his hand on top of the church dogmatics. And all he said to me was, he said, what a remarkable achievement. And that was it. And what?
The dogmatics.
Yeah, the dogmatics. What a remarkable achievement. And that started to put this idea in my head. All right, Pittsburgh Seminary is not a good place for a center for Barth studies. No one there was interested in Karl Barth, really. Andrew Purvis was, but none of the theologians were interested. So, and if you know the story here, just forgive repetition, but I got myself appointed to the executive committee of the Karl Barth Society with the idea of let's put out a request for proposal to schools in North America to see who would like to become home to a Center for Barth Studies. And Kate dug up it's great having Kate, the Karl Barth Society newsletter, fall 1995, a Center for Barth Studies, ? The all-important question mark here, because that was the question that they raised. Is there interest in a Center for Barth Studies? So, two schools showed considerable interest, Yale Divinity School and Princeton Seminary. This was 1995, well, maybe 96, 97 that we went through this process. By that time, I was being recruited to come here, which was really nice. But Princeton's offer included space in its brand new library, which is not this one, which is the one behind that looks old and shabby now, but that was new not that long ago. It included a small budget and included money for a staff person, which is spectacular. Yale could only promise some space once the Divinity Quadrangle was renovated, and that would be a few years from then. So on June 26th, the Karl Barth Society Executive Committee voted to locate the center, at least let Princeton Seminary have their blessing. Bruce, you greased my tracks here to come here as librarian with Tom Gillespie. Don't repeat that. Tom Gillespie was, the president, and he was my hero, and he was a great man for a lot of reasons. But in this particular case, he was especially great because he didn't really know a lot about Karl Barth, but he knew Barth was important, not just for theology, but for the church. And that was what really drove Tom's passion. And in my experience with presidents, this was really unusual. He didn't want a Center for Barth Studies for what Princeton could get from it. He wanted to know how Princeton could make it better, what Princeton could give it to the world. Of course, not everybody was happy with the idea of a Center of Barth Studies here. There was some flack. I got some flack from some faculty members because there was this question of what right did I have to set up a research center in the library. That's sort of the privilege of faculty members. And, well, we dealt with that, but I understand that. I do. But this was way too important to put up to a faculty vote. So you got that. It's really true. And in the meanwhile, George Hunsinger was available, and so I was able to hire him as the first director, and to have an internationally known scholar like George added immediate weight to the place. It was really tremendous. As I got settled here, Bruce filled me in on the Karl Barth world in Switzerland, and he was my teacher in these matters, and he was always a strong voice reminding us not to forget funds for the Gesamtausgabe. It was like your drum you beat. And so we had this RFP, this list of criteria, things we wanted to do, and we just went to Switzerland and said, George and I went, what are we going to do? How do we do this? There's no blueprint for us to do this. So we moved forward. Before we went to Switzerland, I started collecting materials for the library. That was easy. And George started reading groups, which was tremendous, and had conferences. Those were terrific. And the question, it only became clear to me later, would Princeton Seminary try to reestablish formal connections with Basel at the outset, or should we just try to go it alone at first and then see what developed? And that's, again, the way we took, because I think we needed to earn the right to be heard. We needed to prove that we were serious about doing something. And I think that was a better course to take than to try to get something set up and then have expectations be dashed. And once again, Bruce was the ideal teacher here. He had known Markus Barth, spoke German, was also familiar with the Basel archive, and he had known and thought highly of the recently retired and now recently deceased archivist, Heinrich Stuyvesant. That was the upside. That was great connections. The downside, I probably never even told you this, Bruce, especially for someone like me who was not a Barth scholar, did not speak German, but your portrayal of the world of Swiss Barth scholarship as formal and unapproachable, high and mighty, and just terrifying, absolutely terrifying. So off we went, and our agenda was simple. I did have Princeton Seminary behind me, and that was great, and George. Our agenda was simple: to announce that we were in business. We wanted to be helpful. We had a lot of ideas, a little bit of money, and like I said, we had to earn the right to be heard, and I think we did. One of the first things we did was to meet Hans Anton Dreves, the director of the Barth Archive. Well, any nervousness I might have ever felt about meeting a high-powered German theologian was completely vanished in about 5 seconds. I don't think I've ever experienced such warmth from and goodwill from a stranger. Not even my mother. No, I was just kidding. He was incredible. He was incredible. And in addition to being genuinely interested in what we were doing, he took time away from his impossible workload to introduce us to anybody who we thought would be helpful. We didn't really know what we were looking for, but Bruce's guidance on the one hand, Anton's on the other, it was a perfect combination, and we really were able to do great things. Not only did he open his life to Princeton's work, and he really did, but he was also a model to me as a librarian, because he was one who devoted his considerable theological abilities, and they were considerable, to the work of supporting another, who he knew was far more important than he was. But Hans Anton Dreves is an unbelievable theologian and historian, but he devoted his life to this work, and it's so impressive. It was great fun to meet Nicklaus Pater, Nicky Pater, who was working for TVZ as the director then. Your friend had a degree from the seminary, met his wife Rainey, who was the daughter of Hans Jakob and Renata Barth. We went to TVZ to talk to these editors about what we could do, and I had the feeling, I think George did too, that they looked at us sort of amused, like, what are you doing here? And they were very nice. They were very nice. We'd come back to them, and they'd be more interested. After we raised $1 million from the Lilly Endowment, they were suddenly interested. And but it was a wonderful relationship. We had a great time with them. And it seems that whenever we met Nicky, he was always taking us to an Italian restaurant and selecting the wine. Does that sound familiar? I recall that Bruce was, surprised that Anton and I became so familiar so soon. Yeah, we ran together. I mean, we just really hit it off. Yeah, Lorraine, and then up on that, like a farm area up. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, after my first couple of visits, I stayed in his house with him in the third floor guest room, and that was so cool. And then at night, we'd sit around that little Barth study, and he had this big cabinet full of all the bottles of things that people sent to him in appreciation for his research. He is a great friend. He's one of my favorite people, and if you know him, I take great pride and pleasure in the fact that he considers me responsible for his marriage to his wonderful wife, Miriam. What? It's true. Well, yeah, we had this. He's a confirmed bachelor, and Miriam, if you know Miriam, she's just energy and delightful and loving and sweet and fun, and it's also considerably younger than he is. And I remember talking to him, going for a walk one day, and he said, "What am I to do? I'm too old to get married." What? Yeah, what will people? I know. What will people say? That was his big thing. What did you say? What I said to him was, "We have a word in English that describes men like you when there are young, attractive women interested in them." He said, "What's that?" And I said, "Lucky." So it's great. They give me great joy whenever I get a chance to see them. One of the things that he did was to introduce me to you and to your family, and it was just, it's just a real joy to get to know you, and you were also interested in our work, and but it was a very this kind of stuff is ambiguous as a librarian. I sometimes I'm like an ambulance chaser, following. You know what that word that means in German? Ambulance chaser, someone who chases after dead people's widows. Because librarians like me, we get collections of things from people who are deceased, and I got to see your house, and your parents' house in Rien. Peter lived there, I believe, and Marcus's study was filled with books and papers, and your mother had a study there too, if I recall, and it was shown to me as a point of pride. This is where my mother did her work, and it was just a great experience. To make a long story short, in a few months, a huge number of boxes arrived at Princeton Seminary, and so did the standing desk, which is now upstairs. And it was full of all sorts of, the paper this morning, the correspondence was so rich. That was a perfect example of the kind of riches that are in that collection. And the Markus Barth family, they're the ones who really pushed us on the question of, well, you have a Center for Barth Studies. Well, there's a lot of Barths. Who else is included here? And that's exactly the right question. So I think we've been open to that. It was a really helpful remark. But and as great as the materials were, it was the relationships that really made this all possible. There's no doubt. And I could just go on and on and on, really. It's one of the joys of my life. This led to the Princeton-Basel Agreement in 2001. A delegation from Princeton went to Basel, formalized the agreement. It's a high point of my life. It was really spectacular.
He's not telling you an important part of this puzzle because it's so self-effacing, but you got a $1.2 million grant from the Lilly Foundation to fund a number of projects, and every one of them is laid out very deeply. Mr. Crocco, he was the person who created the application. He was the person who convinced them of the importance of this. He was the one who got the grant.
Well,
And what it enabled us to do cheaply was to digitalize the materials that were unpublished on acidic paper in the Kawasaki. And that's why there was an agreement.
well, it was a great occasion in the city hall, town hall. This sumptuous meal at this gorgeous building overlooking the Rhine. It was fun. It was good work. I felt really proud of that work that we did, that Princeton did. It wasn't until I looked in those papers, I found this paper trail of this Marcus's plan to start a Karl Barth Center in North America. And when I saw the list of things that he envisioned, I was really gratified because we had thought of all those things and more. I don't think there's anything that he had envisioned except raising money that we couldn't really do. But we managed to pick up on the things he envisioned. But here's the point I want to make. Apart from all these great materials, without the help and support of people, support that only grows in relationships and breaking bread together, that's where all this happened. It was human relationships and trust that develops, and the freedom that comes to ask questions from people you know. Like Bruce said, we did raise over $1 million. We digitized the church dogmatics. And one of the things I was so happy about was to digitize and microfilm all the manuscripts in that archive. And if you've been there, it's his last house. It's a nice house. It's got some fire suppression stuff. But Anton, whenever he would go away for the weekend, he'd worry if he left the gas on. It was awful to have that be the house where all these treasures were located, thousands of photographs and other things. So we digitized that. Now there's a copy here, the copy there, and a copy under some mountain in Switzerland somewhere. Started an online bibliography, conferences. We've interviewed people who knew Barth. And the goal was that Princeton would become the one place in the world where anybody doing research on Barth could go knowing that they would almost certainly find what they needed. And that was motivated this. There were a few missteps along the way, and Kate and I talk about them. We've had a hard time dealing with T&T Clark and on this whole issue of copyright of the church dogmatics, but that's another matter. There's so many people, people in this room, Bruce and Daryl and George and Kate and others, Ken Henke from Special Collections, that kept the good things happening. And if this was a book, I'd be thanking Cliff Anderson as much as anybody. He was an absolutely remarkable contribution to all this. As I thought about this conference, one of my regrets was that I couldn't invite everybody down the street to my old house, which is what we would have done had I still lived here, because that's the fellowship that these relationships have led to. A year after going to Yale, I ran into Serene Jones. She was the president of Union Theological Seminary and was on the Yale faculty at the time when this proposal went out. And after we caught up, she said, I bet you wish you had selected Yale instead of Princeton. And and there was some truth to that. I was a little, but after being at Yale for 3 years, there is no way that I could have, or anybody could have started a Barth Center there, even though the Yale wanted to. The faculty did. There's way too much attention paid to long-range planning and fundraising and endowments. And because the library there does not report to the Divinity School, it reports to the university library system. There's a bureaucracy, that's almost impossible. And that makes a point that, I think while Princeton Seminary would share many of Yale's concerns about long-term financial viability, because we are in an age of much greater accountability, Princeton still has an amazing amount of flexibility that should not be taken for granted. This is a unique place. It really is truly, and I've been away now for 3-4 years or more than that, and I can just see how unique it is. I'm going to conclude now, but I just want to urge all of you, if you feel interested, called to it, to refresh and renew our relationships and to create new ones in the hopes of surpassing not only Markus Barth's vision, but the vision that got this started. Bruce and I and others, our generation, Daryl, our generation is starting to turn, and there's going to be a need for a younger generation to come along to pick up this mantle and carry this forward. There's still, from my vantage point at Yale, there's still a lot of things to be done here, and in my remaining years, anything I can do to help is be a joy. Thank you very much.